But what happens there is that Sobukwe says, let it be remembered that we refused to plead, having it that you have no authority upon which to judge us. Now, what he's doing in this response to the magistrate is to call into question the legal order itself. He's now saying, it is not I who is the criminal. The very basis by which you command me, you charge me, you examine me according to this law, this is not a law. You are in fact a military occupier in violation of the natural and even international law, who is attempting to give this force, this gun that you are pointing at me, the appearance of law.
Dr. Ndumiso Dladla, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here. We appreciate you taking the time to grace us with your presence, and we're looking forward to chatting to you.
No, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
Great. So let's kick off with you giving our viewers a brief introduction of who you are, what you do.
Okay. I am the child of Pratim and Sis Ivy, affectionately known by close friends and even students as Brandums. But I teach in the Department of Jurisprudence at the University of Pretoria's Faculty of Law. And my interests are quite wide and varied, but they include South African political history, historiography, law, and political philosophy.
Great. And how did you come to be here?
I think...
What informed the choices you've made in terms of your career?
I think my earliest particular habit of mine was, being argumentative and curious. As early as I can remember, I was always thought to be excessively curious and also excessively argumentative. That desire to detect contradictions in what was said, especially by those who are in authority, which when you're a child, everyone has some kind of authority. But to detect arbitrariness, to detect contradiction, and bring it to attention. If my mother says, I'm to be shouted at for spilling sugar on the table, but my father does the same thing and is not shouted at, it means that spilling sugar on the table doesn't necessarily lead to being shouted at. So I would ask, what is the difference between me and my father, that this is the sort of response that's warranted for him, but not for me? So this line of inquiring after contradictions and forcing people to provide the foundations for the rules that they imposed on me and on others is probably the earliest memory of the way in which I've always thought. Are lies always bad? So many of the things, why can we not whistle in the house, but we may sing, if both are ways of creating melody? What is it about this? Why can musicians play their flute inside of the house, but we cannot whistle? So just finding out why the things we're supposed to obey are to be obeyed. So this following this question, first, once I was in school, it led me to fights with authority because these kinds of arbitrary violations of people's rights became more commonplace in school. And soon enough, I joined the debating team and was told by people that I should probably become a lawyer because I ended up, once you're able to fight for yourself, people tend to leave you alone and they tend to offer you special things in order to keep you out of their way. they initially will say, you get special rules. The others must do this, but not you. So it eventually became one on behalf of everyone together, and I became a kind of instigator. So I first developed an interest in philosophy because of a cousin of mine who studied philosophy at Wits when I was in high school. And I knew I liked it because it was the only discipline that was open to incessant inquiry. You could continue asking why without being stopped in the name of any convention. It was encouraged. But my parents were both teachers, which is probably part of the reason I'm this way. But they discouraged me from pursuing teaching for money-related reasons. They said, the job is difficult and, it's not particularly rewarding. So I thought I wouldn't become a teacher, and law was encouraged. It was a much more glitzy profession. But as I got to law school, I found that the idlozile philosophy continued to preside on why this law, until I dropped out of law school and actually gave up to idlozi of the questions and decided, so I met the old man that you interviewed some time ago at a bus stop in Pretoria while I was still a law student. And our ongoing conversations ended up with me deregistering my legal studies and moving to Ethiopia to go and study with him closely. And, the course of more and more studies then eventually led to a position at the university where I started teaching others how to trouble their parents and other figures of authority.
So I'm curious what response you got from your mom regarding the spilling of sugar.
No, to the credit of my parents, they didn't respond to my incessant questioning and troubling with authoritarianism. They were often embarrassed, often frustrated, but I found that if I was able to argue and show the injustice of a policy, they would change it. And I think this is what encouraged me to continue. So I was a child who was never made to shut up. And I think that lots of people came to regret that later on in life. So I took this method out into the world and continued to do this to other figures of authority. So I think I do have my mother to thank for conceding to reason. It made me believe that the power of speech, of examining habits and finding out the reasons behind them and exposing them to those who were sincere in understanding could lead to changes, which has basically been the approach of my adult life and how I conduct my relationships with others, that rules may not be given without justification. So my parents dared to justify themselves to me, and I think this led me to never accept rules without justification.
Yeah. Lucky you. It's all good that they saw who you were, they nurtured that, and you continued, fed it, and you grew in that area. But that can't have made your life easy in society.
No, it probably didn't, but I think it was such a deeply seated thing in me that I don't think I could have been happy otherwise. At various points in my life, I have been told or been offered that simply submitting or being quiet will lead to a better outcome for me, whether it's more money, more peace, more rewards of one sort or another. But I don't think I would have been able to accept any of that if I didn't believe that it stood on a firm foundation. So I have been relentless in the pursuit of my own happiness and find I'm a generally happy human being. But it's because of applying this approach of agreeing to nothing which doesn't stand on a strong foundation that I can see the justification of. So I never stop asking why until I've been satisfied that is the case. And so it has had its costs. I was disciplined in school. I was threatened. I've had to leave places of work as a result of this. But I think the idea of being true to oneself and following this, it's the only foundation of a place in which I can sleep easily at night. So I continue to sleep relatively well, even as old age creeps up on me. And I don't regret this, even though I realize there are other ways that human beings can be conditioned. But I try to encourage my students as well, never to submit to force, whatever the cost might be, never to be commanded without reason.
So that leads us very nicely into the reason you are here, to commemorate Steve Biko's legacy.
Yes.
You talk about never submitting to command, unless it makes sense, and never submit to fear. Tell us your attraction. What appeals to you about Mr. Biko?
Yes, I suppose that it's exactly this kind of resonance. I think in the early parts of my high school, I think I came of age at the beginning of the Rainbow Nation. So I think it was only kindergarten that I went to, one of our own nursery schools, and I started in the so-called multiracial schools from grade 1. And my first personal encounter with white supremacy, I suppose that it would take a long time for me to discover that white supremacy encountered me from the moment of my first breath and determined the hospital I was born in, what it was called, the township that I lived in. But this took a longer time to discover, to come to understand. But my first day at school, I think I was spat on by a white kid whose name I remember. I can't remember anything else, but his name was Mark. And I remember that I took the attitude of home. I knew this was wrong. And in fact, the loyally part of me was also there already, because I knew that the evidence was his saliva on my face and that I can't wipe it away and expect to be believed and win in my case. So I ran to the teacher with this slob of his trickling down my face as evidence that he had done this and he needed to be punished. At that stage, the teacher was shocked. Now, I am sure we were amongst the first crop of black kids she taught. She herself must have been desperate for a job to stay in the school, because we heard there was a large exodus of white teachers upon our admission. But the teacher eventually called the child's parents in, and he was asked to apologize. And his parents actually withdrew him from the school, rather than asking that he simply do that. So this is my earliest encounter with the white world at an interpersonal level. But towards high school, I began fighting these kinds of racial inconsistencies in the way that the school dealt with things that happened to black children. And it was a fairly, I think in primary school, I eventually moved to a place that was more consistently Rainbow Nation. We were encouraged, and I had lots of friends from different racial groups, as they say in South Africa. But once I got to high school, the marks were quite clear. It was like a prison yard in which we were all broken down into gangs. And even the white kids that you knew in primary school, once you were in high school, they went to be with their own people. So because of the conditions at the school. So I became confrontational with the school because of all these things. And my father very early on introduced me to Biko. I think in standard 6 or 7, he gave me I write what I like, suggesting that, in fact, this rainbow business that you're struggling with, it's not all political thinking in our history that would have led to this sort of, so I became exposed to Biko from that time in finding strength and in finding some way to deal with what I was experiencing. I think he was introducing me to a historicized study of white supremacy in South Africa by giving me this book. And I'm very grateful, although it led to me getting into more trouble and being unable to accept what I was told I was supposed to accept. So this was my earliest introduction to Biko, long before he became an interest of my scholarly research. It was more like a survival book for me on how to understand white people and the roots of what it was that they were getting up to, which I was struggling with.
Mm. It's a hectic book for you to read at that early age. Reading it is quite evocative. How did you manage that?
I suppose that the other thing I should be thankful to my parents for, and I wish more of my students had been reared this way. From that very earliest time, I learned to read, I'm sure with most children, in primary school or just before. And for most of my childhood, I wasn't allowed to watch television after 7 o'clock. But I never liked sleeping early. I still don't. I work nocturnally and usually sleep at 2, 3 at night. It's been that way since I've been in charge of my own clock. But as a result, I read a lot because I wasn't allowed to sleep. I wasn't allowed to watch TV, but I was able to stay up late. My mom would only switch off my light at 10 in primary school, and it moved up to about midnight later. So I was in the habit, and when I got older, I suppose non-fiction became interesting in one way or the other. So, of course, I suppose that I was in desperate need of a way of making sense of what I was seeing. And I'm sure that the degree, one always sees the poverty of one's interpretation of things once one reads them a year later with more experience. So I'm sure that the level of my interpretation at that stage was far simpler than it is now. It's one of those books that I've continued to reread and teach from throughout my adult life. But even at that stage, it was written clearly and simply enough to provide me with a great deal of sense of what was happening. So it's complicated when it's placed in its proper context, but also very simple and straightforward in the way in which it's written and argued. So it was an invitation for me to the study of South African history, which made better sense of it later on.
Okay, you say you continue to teach it to people even right now. What is it that you teach people about it, and what's your success rate if you look at the state of society right now?
Well, I suppose that in the 90s, during the period where I came up, I wasn't exactly a born free. I was born in 1986. As they say, I don't think any of the children of this continent have been born free in the past few centuries. But I definitely, I came of age during the time of the transition. And I think that until fairly recently, the popular method of understanding racism was as an individual psychological or moral phenomenon in which racism was located in the heart of a particular white person who was either good or bad. And if he was good, he wasn't a racist. And if he was bad, then he was a racist. And the way to deal with racism was to change the hearts and minds of racists, And I think that there are still many people who think of racism this way, as rooted in attitudinal, psychological, or moral problems, and that by making the person better, by making them understand better, you resolve racism. And I think what emerges from a study of Biko, and we will speak a little bit about the historical context, because I think it is useful to study history through individuals, but it's also important to see that they are just a slice of history, and that individuals are not self-producing. In order to understand even individuals properly, you have to place them in the historical context. So Biko provides the expression of something which has a long history in South Africa. The historian, sociologist Gail Gerhardt suggests, in a way that other historians have done, that at the moment of oppression, there are two basic kinds of responses. One she calls the realist response, which is the sort which is to accept the reality as it is. Ukuthi sebashayile ibona abazosinika umthetho. The best way to survive is to obey and hope that in the little province of activity they leave you, you might excel and become, whatever. And the other she calls the rebel tendency, which is a refusal to submit to injustice, regardless of the force at the disposal of the enemy. But this is a tendency which, although can be found in Biko and the Black consciousness movement, is as long as the encounter with the white man, that at the time of being confronted with a superior military force, there are those that saw cause in this to submit and recognize that the world now belonged to the one with superior force, and those that from that moment were trying to find ways to overcome this force in order to restore justice. And this has happened throughout the 400 years plus that whites have been here, So what I try to teach in Biko to students is precisely the origins of this tendency. I teach law students these days, and I suppose that one question that we must always ask, one question is, why do people obey the law? Why, for instance, do we live in a country in which a great majority of people are hungry and a great number of people nevertheless obey the law not to steal? Even within the realm of legal order, there is a basic natural principle, which is that one may not obey the law at the expense of one's life. That's why we have things like self-defense or necessity. The idea in all legal systems is that you must obey the law only until the point at which obeying it might cost you your own life. So if you and I are on a raft at sea which will capsize if I don't push you off, the law is silent. I may push you off, leading to your certain death, in order to defend my own life. The law may not command me to sacrifice my life in order to obey it. And yet, despite the great crime statistics of South Africa, many people continue to obey the law at the expense of their life. Otherwise we should have had a wholesale revolt against the legal order. And the question is why? This is a question which has troubled me. And amongst people, there are always those who are told this is the law and it must be obeyed, and they continue to do so. And there are those who will get to the root of this question. So Biko was one of those people to whom this question. He had a bigger brother, of course, who had been a member of the PAC. So even this way of approaching things was transmitted to him by a predecessor tied to the history of our people from but this is the thing which is important to me, that, how is it that some see in this injunction to obey nothing controversial, and others are troubled by this and could start to try to understand, when did we start obeying this, and why do we have to obey this, and eventually disobey it, and that those who are in power generally are not very pleased by the tendency of those who question why must this be obeyed, and try to quieten and eliminate it from history as soon as possible. Whereas those that teach obedience are usually preserved, given statues, appear on money, this is the kind of approach which is usually is much better for business. So it is disobedience, or the question about why must we obey, that I find most crucial in Biko. That law students, because they teach this system of command, and their facilities, they work, they are being taught to practice the law, to interpret the commands, to ask why the commands and why ought they to be obeyed, if at all.
Okay. The first thing, I imagine you were talking about Babu Mangalis Sobukwe. I don't want to take for granted that everyone knew who you were talking about.
When I say a predecessor of Biko, yes.
Okay, cool. And the second thing, you advocate for that in your teachings of people. What concrete examples can you share with us of where this has been done successfully? I mean, particularly since our constitutional democracy and the supremacy of the Constitution and everything that comes with it.
Okay. First, I should say there's a thought which I didn't complete, which I'll complete very quickly, about race, which is to say that in Biko, what we found was an idea of race rooted in what you might call a structural analysis, which doesn't interpret racism as the preserve of white people's minds and hearts, but as a question of the way in which power is organized. That no matter how nice a particular white man, how enlightened, how educated, he will continue to enjoy the fruits of racism regardless of his conscience if you are in a racist society. He will have a longer life expectancy, drink cleaner water, get access to better education because of the structural orientation of the society. So rather than focusing on changing people's hearts and minds, we should focus on the question of power and the organization of society. This is the most important thing I learned from Biko, against the background of a time when we were being taught that racism was a moral phenomenon of good people and bad people who could be found on all sides. Okay.
Cool.
So that racism is white supremacy. It is a system, a hierarchized organization of society which places blacks at the lowest rungs and corresponds to unnatural levels of death and dying, and associates white life with a surplus of life, with long life expectancies, multiple houses, more food than one could possibly eat, Now, as for the question of disobedience and its expression in the contemporary, I suppose that because focus is also of a historical nature, at various points, he enjoins black people to reinterpret their history and to recognize that whom the white man has spent his ink portraying as a villain to be, to be detested even by the indigenous people, is likely our hero. Ushaka kasenza ngakhona, Nottingham, that we need to look at the way in which they portrayed those blacks who in history produce problems for them is probably a clue of what we ought to be doing. And these, the white man's scoundrels, are very likely our heroes, whereas who the white man would have be our hero is very likely a scoundrel for us. Now, the current constitutional order is itself organized around a historical mythology of heroes and scoundrels, and is associated with the magnanimity and forgiveness of some of the heroes who are counterposed to some villains who apparently wanted to throw white people into the sea. Now, the question of the constitutional order is apt because it is a legal order that South Africans are enjoined to obey, because we are told that our forebears died for it, right? When black people ask any questions about the prevailing order, we are told that I myself should say that I have never voted. I have never exercised this vote because I've never interpreted the struggle for liberation to be a struggle to vote. I think that this is a great error. But very often around election times, we're given lectures that people died so we could vote. The ANC has indeed reinterpreted South African political history to be a struggle to vote. And if one studies the ANC, one will see that even Mandela is not responsible for this. This is why I say that Biko is important, but we need to place him in the historical context of the tendency which his life and thoughts is an expression of. The ANC, very shortly after its existence, it began as the South African Natives National Congress in 1912, but it's one of its earliest petitions after the 1913 Land Act was to King George V. And in this petition, which I don't know by head, though it's something which I would suggest that your viewers go and have a look at. It is the petition to King George V in 1914. In this text, the ANC say to King George, amongst other things, that he is their king and they are his lawful subjects. They say that he has conquered them, and as a result of conquering them, became their lawful king and is the owner of all the territory. They then call themselves his humble children and ask for him to extend to them the same rights that are there for the rest of his subjects, which are other white people, to purchase. So the idea here is that, from my own understanding, this suggests that the ANC was never a liberation movement because, colonialism is always founded on warfare. Conquest is a word which is used loosely by many people, but it describes an event in warfare in which one who has superior force can bring the other to submit to their will. To conquer someone is not to kill them. It's not to imprison them. To conquer someone, they must live, but agree that you are now their master. Okay? So the foundation of the colonial order and even slavery is conquest. The ANC submits and says, you've conquered us, and as a result of this conquest, are now the rightful lawgiver. You may now command us, but we ask for the protection in terms of your command to be able to do such and such. Now, there are others who never took this seriously, even at that time, to say, to beat a man in war, in an unprovoked unleashing of violence upon a person, is no civilized or sensible, let alone just basis upon which to establish your rights to give them law and to own their territory. And so, there are those who did not take this approach. But a movement for national liberation is precisely about the repudiation of the idea that the white man can rightfully rule over those that, over nothing, no other authority than that he has beaten them in warfare, in an unprovoked and unjustified warfare. So the point is that if we read Biko carefully, because he died, as you know, in a physical confrontation with a white man who was attempting to command him to the last breath on the basis of nothing but physical force, to say, if you strike me, I strike back, I will not submit. It was their refusal to submit until their last breath, which is the final lesson for us here, that he should have known that there was no chance that he could defeat them in combat, no matter how skilled a fighter he may have been, because they had a superior force. But nevertheless, he refused to submit to the justice of being commanded by nothing other than raw force, So before, we see Sobukwe had done the same thing in courts. If you look at the court case of Mandela and you look at the court case of Sobukwe, the Mandela trial is the more famous one, where we hear, I have fought white domination. I have fought black domination. Everyone has always wondered where Mandela fought black domination in the 1960s in South Africa, when we were literally a white dominion. But that aside, the idea is that he says democracy is an ideal for which is prepared to die. But in the technical parlance of the court, Mandela pleads not guilty, right? Sobukwe, very interestingly enough, shortly after the Sharpeville massacre, as whites now call it, when they are placed, he's accused, number one, and it's before, because the result of the Sharpeville affair was that South Africa eventually became a republic. So the court cases at that time were the king or queen of England versus the people, versus the person so accused. So the case was the queen. It was Regina versus Mangaliso Sobukwe and others. The same queen, the same crown that Mandela's forebearers, the petitioners of 1914, had said, you are our lawful king, continued to charge blacks throughout the period from then until 1960, after the Sharpeville affair. But what happens there is that Sobukwe says, let it be remembered that we refused to plead, having it that you have no authority upon which to judge us. Now, what he's doing in this response to the magistrate is to call into question the legal order itself. He's now saying, it is not I who is the criminal. The very basis by which you command me, you charge me, you examine me according to this law, this is not a law. You are in fact a military occupier in violation of the natural and even international law, who is attempting to give this force, this gun that you are pointing at me, the appearance of law, the appearance of a rightful command. But it is not a rightful command, because you killed my ancestors on the peril of a gun and now would pretend that you can command me. So be the criminal that you are and do your will. If you're going to send me to, let's not pretend that this is a judgment according to the law. This is pure force. So use your force. But remember that we refuse to plead. The magistrate, of course, is not familiar with this reasoning and says, okay, not guilty is the plea that I enter for you. And they charge them. Of course, they refuse a defense. They refuse to have lawyers stand by counterposition to our other brother who has George Bezos and Chaskals, the who's who of the, they refuse to defend themselves against that which ought not to be defended against using the law, because it is unlawfulness. So Biko takes this same approach, that there is no moral basis for this order. We do not have to obey. This is pretending to law, but all it is force, even by the political standard of the white man. Democracy is supposedly a way to consult all the people in a territory who are of adult age in order to convert their will, their mandate into law that binds everyone. So the point is that this thing is a dictatorship, according to that only a small percentage of you are able to exercise your political rights and then make law, but which for us, who have nothing to do with this law, to be bound, even by your Westminster system, this is not law. So this is the argument. Now, the point is, with the constitutional order, the argument would carry the same force that, despite the constitution being presented as a result of popular will, a close black consciousness examination of the constitutional order reveals that this is not indeed the case. Whites in 1992 held a referendum. It was in order to get a mandate from South Africa's white adult population by the National Party, who were the ruling party in the white parliament, about whether to continue negotiations with the ANC. Now, what is often not discussed, if you speak to many whites today, they'll say, oh, in 1992, we voted to end apartheid. And look at what you guys are doing. As a way both of suggesting that they took the moral responsibility to give up the power that they had. They took this referendum. But if you study the contents of what was promised to whites, you find a much more mischievous picture. So de Klerk promised whites, I encourage your readers to have a look for themselves. There is a historian in 1993 who wrote a book, a text called the 1992 referendum. Her name is Annette Strauss. She was at the University of the Free State, and I think it's the Journal of African Studies. In this piece, she just surveys the historical conditions around the survey. Now, it wasn't just the National Party that wanted a strong mandate. Many white multinational corporations also asked white workers to give de Klerk a strong mandate to say, yes, go and negotiate. Now, de Klerk explained to whites that if I show an unwillingness to negotiate, we have a lot of bargaining power right now. The Western world is looking to us with the responsibility of overseeing this transition. If we don't play ball, we will lose our bargaining power and things will happen without our will and input. But if you give me a strong mandate, I can still make guarantees of things that I can get for you. Now, these are some of the things that I think it's important you should know that de Klerk promised whites. One, de Klerk promised whites that they would keep all of their property. Okay? That included land and their corporations, that they would keep their pension funds, their investments, all of this. Two, de Klerk promised white South Africans that there would be a retention of the free market system, that capitalism would continue to prevail in South Africa, and on which the profits which they made so handsomely in South Africa depended. But the most important one of the things that were promised, I think, was that de Klerk promised them that he would bring an end to parliamentary supremacy. This means that de Klerk suggested, it's important to understand that throughout the period in which whites ruled South Africa, even before the South Africa became a union, in the colony of the Cape and even in the Boer republics, white South Africans used a system of parliamentary sovereignty. So if they had a majority of people given a mandate by different constituent groups, they could make a law. That's how they made the 1913 Land Act. Whites agreed that they needed a law to seize up the majority of the land and place us on 7%. They sat down, all who say aye, there was a simple majority, a law was made. De Klerk said, we will make sure that they never have this power that we had to do all that we have done. If you give me a strong mandate, we will impose a constitution upon them, which will be near impossible to change, which will remove their capacity to use law to do what we have done, to build everything we have done. And indeed, more than 80% of them gave him the mandate. Now, if you look on our side of the so-called liberation movement, I've already made the point that uKhongolose was never a liberation movement.
That's very controversial. You've indicated why.
Yes.
You've told us about them writing
Yes.
to their masters. That's not the pervasive view, though, in society. If you had to pick any random number of people in the street right now, just going out of there, they would actually probably fight with you for saying that.
Indeed. So mine is a technical definition. As I'm saying, colonialism is founded on a doctrine in international law called the right of conquest. In the white man's law, this was considered to be a legal principle, that if you beat someone in war, you're entitled both to rule over them and to their territory. Now, if you study the history of the white man from the time of Van Riebeck, he made the assertion to the Khoikhoi and said, I have now defeated you in a defensive war, and so the land is now mine. This was the basis of the white man's claim, okay? That is how Roman Dutch law became transplanted to become the law of this land, despite us having no history of either being Romans or Dutch people. This became the legal order because sovereignty was transferred from Holland to the territory of what they called South Africa through their supposed defeat of us in this war. Now, if you're a liberation movement, their objective is twofold. One, the restoration of title to territory, maibuye i-Afrika, right? Izwe elethu. This is the first part, to restore the land to the people. And two, to restore the law of the people, the law of the land, so that the sovereignty which presides. Now, sovereignty is a multifold concept in legal philosophy, but the point is that the very system which prevails over our lives is an expression of the sovereign will, whether it's the law about theft or murder, whether it's how it is that we can throw away food, is a result of the law. Now, if you're a liberation movement, you're saying that you wish that the people should get back their territory and the law of the people should apply. Now, in 1914, I'm telling you that uKhongolose said, Nishayile mpini, you have defeated us, and as a result have come to be our legitimate lawgivers and also own our territory. So, Umbango one, they were a civil rights movement. What they wished was to get civil and political rights for black people, to be able to vote, to be like white subjects. So the point, if you think that uKhongolose changed its mind, in 1955, they were just shortly celebrating the Freedom Charter. Freedom Charter is based on the same principle. South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black or white. For those who may find this controversial, I use an example, which I use in a text written with an Julie Webster called Who Conquered South Africa? The example we make in this article is that Imagine I invade your house here. I come into your house. I kill your guards. I kill some of your family. And then I throw you and your family into the garden and declare, this is now my house. One, umuzi wami lo, sekukhale sami isicathulo, umthetho wami. Those are the two conditions which come from conquest. One, the territory is mine. Two, the law which applies in this territory is now mine. You know, umthetho sokuthi mawufuna ukungena ukhiphe icathulo egeyidini, if ufuna ubungibona fanele kuze nama-apula, sekunomthetho omusha owami manje, right? Now say you and your children are in the garden working to feed me and mine in the house. Now you come on 1955, several hundred years, and you say, lendlu le yethu sobabili, mina nawe, you know, kuzosebenza umthetho wethu lo. You see, Guti, nobody in their common sense would consider this to be sensible. That I throw you out to turn you into a slave in my garden, you suddenly come to the gate and you knock to tell me that actually you deserve some rooms in your house. This I am contesting is no vision of liberation. You know, this integration, it's a submission to the pre-existing will of the conqueror. And indeed, many amongst whites said certain blacks should be allowed to join us in the house under these conditions. This is what the liberal tradition said. If Abotaki can go to school, can profess faith for our God, then they should be allowed to participate. But the savage ones should not. Bazo destroy this whole thing. So to capitulate to this and then call that liberation, the question is liberation from what? Because you accept the sovereign power of the conqueror, and you accept that conquest has entitled the conqueror to the territory. So a liberation movement, by definition, needs to restore the sovereign title of the people to the territory. And I'm saying that Ukongolos, there's a small exception, of course, during the period of the Youth League, from the 1940s, from the late 40s until the Charter, there were the Africanists who arose within Ukongolos who wished to turn it into a liberation movement, but they were expelled. They were expelled from Ukongolos and eventually formed the PAC. This is why Biko, you know, I think the essay is called We Blacks, suggests that Black consciousness actually began in the 1950s when Blacks took the responsibility over their own destiny. And he's describing the departure of the Africanists from Ukongolos. But the ANC itself wished for civil. If you don't believe this, here is another example. During the time when the organizations were already banned, do you know that the ANC never raised an objection at the United Nations about the presence of South Africa? So the United Nations Charter required that only democracies be given the right to represent the populations of the territories which they keep. Now, South Africa was a member state of the UNO, and the ANC, under the leadership of its stinkers, Wabo Benjamin Turo, never raised an objection about this. It took the PAC in 1974 to make the point that, but the National Party is not the rightful ruler of the country. They don't have a mandate from the majority of the population. How can they speak on behalf of South Africa and its interests at the UN? And that's how it was suspended. That never came. So and here's a final example. When the PAC's armed wing killed white people, the ANC wrote from exile to denounce this as acts of terror. Okay? Now, terrorism in international law has a very specific definition. A movement for national liberation is protected in the Geneva conventions because they stand for a sovereign power. Impi, in law, a war is not simply the outbreak of violence. It's a particular kind of violence between states, between competing sovereigns. Now, a movement for national liberation, because it contests the sovereignty of whoever is in charge, makes war proper, a war for national liberation. Now, for a liberation movement to denounce another liberation movement's violence against the state as terror suggests that there is no war which is happening. So they interpreted it as a civil affair rather than an affair between states. So various signs, if you examine the Congress, suggest that their objective was simply to be integrated by the extension of civil and political rights to black people, not to overturn the legal order and not to restore territory. And we can go over a century of repeated instances in which they reaffirm that their objective was simply to join the white man at the table, not to ask whose table is this in the first place that we should be joining others on it, rather than, as Biko says of his table, that we will expel everyone from this table and reorganize the table in an African style. That is sovereign power. So the table in Biko is territory, umhlaba. The arrangement of the table is sovereign power. That only after we've restored our title to territory and we've restored our sovereignty over it, may we invite those who are willing to understand and accept that it is our table and it is styled according. Those who can accept ukuthi Africa yethu and umthetho wethu uthi kanje, they may come and live with us. Now, a real liberation movement would have wanted to proceed on the basis of what is called in international law state succession. This means that once we take power as the people of the land, we are not bound by the debts of the criminals who had held the state. In private law, even today, if I steal your cell phone and I sell it to one of the brothers here, the law cannot expect that you must go and buy the phone from the person who I've sold it to. The law entitles you to gain your phone back, regardless of what kind of justification he gives for how he came. He may have a claim against me because I sold him a phone that was not mine, but you cannot have your phone kept from you. Now, how is it with a state that without the will of the people of South Africa, these guys were able to sell our gold, our diamonds, our farmland, our fish to corporations, and then we supposedly come into power and accept that much of the country has been sold to these corporations, and we say we have a limited budget in such a wealthy country, So the preoccupation of the international community, which are investors and other countries where these companies are actually based and pay taxes, their preoccupation is with the kind of mad people who will come into charge and restore the territory to the people, because it means that whatever they have built, whatever they believe they own, they don't actually own. And in law, it is true. If you come and you build a structure on my land and I come into repossession of my land, that structure is mine. It belongs to me.
That's not how it works in practice in that regard, is it? I understand it on the forecast.
Yes. Well, what I'm saying is the interest of having this as legitimate, to present them as the legitimate and only representatives of the people of South Africa, is because the program which they were pushing was far more palatable to the interests that were already invested in South Africa.
Yes.
The alternative would have created a catastrophe. There's recently a biography of Harry Oppenheimer, which was published, I think, a year ago, which goes into some details about his preoccupation and concern with the PAC approach, and that this was the favorable. So the people who own the country in real terms required an interlocutor to pacify the indigenous people. This goes to the root of why, people are always beguiled by this Sobukwe, why he was, why the South African system decided to imprison him apart from others, didn't want his speech to be recorded and understood by other black people, and banned him from parliament, kept on renewing his sentence outside of court to prevent him from having any access to the people. Because this is something which he understood very simply, which never became a mainstream part of South African politics. That izwe lethu means that this entire system that they've erected on the basis of this unlawful injustice does not stand, and we are in fact entitled we do not have to pay the loans that the Boers took to buy guns in order to shoot black children. We are not bound by that. They didn't have our mandates in order to contract our state. So this is a catastrophe for the world of profit. So the profiteers who also sponsored Bukongolos during the first elections, they have very specific interest in the narrative that emerges, because South Africa, it doesn't exist for itself. The gold and diamonds, they are not enjoyed by the people of this country. It is the places where these benefits are that had the interest to sponsor these lovely biographies of Mandela, to sponsor these historical accounts of a long tradition of struggle by the ANC. What we read is the writing of the stenographers of empire. It is not necessarily a reflection of the truth,
Mm. One of the things that I find surprising is that you say everything that you've said, and yet historically, the performance of the BC political organizations, even the PAC for that matter, the PAC maybe in the beginning did marginally better than the BC movements, but it's never performed decently at all.
Yes.
With everything that you are saying, you would expect that they would enjoy much bigger support. What's the issue there?
Indeed. What is interesting is that you yourself said that most people would be surprised to hear what I'm arguing. And so what people even know or understand about our history is, unfortunately, itself disfigured. The world of multi-party electoral politics is a curious world which is always influenced by money. Statisticians of the American elections for a long time held that the party with the biggest election budget always wins the election. But if you study the sponsors of the Republicans and the Democrats, you find the same funders: Manhattan Chase Bank, JP Morgan, BlackRock, Texas Oil. So, that the problem of a multi-party system which is based on the private financing of political parties is that although electoral theory tells us that the people who vote give a mandate to the politicians who then go and make law on their behalf, the entrance of money into the system means actually the mandate comes from the corporations. So if I sponsor a political party and it has more adverts, there are history books written about it. It is even taught at schools according to its own interest. It already begins to campaign at primary school level. There is an educationist named Chana Tiga. I've heard that she recently she's a sociologist of education who studied the teaching of South African history from the time of the transition to see how the PAC and ANC were dealt with in the school curriculum. And, she reveals very many fascinating factors that the drafters of the history books themselves are actually Abantu Bakakongolos. and the narrative which the school children are supposed to come out against is that the PAC is racist. It would have destroyed the country. Most people know the PAC as a party that wanted to throw white people into the sea and said one settler, one bullet. As I said, that even Sobukwe, its greatest luminary, finding his actual writing or speech was made impossible by acts of law. So the question of popularity is one which also depends on consciousness. If you ask children, if you ask children to choose between spinach and sweets as an everyday diet, most children will pick their sweets. And this is a question of consciousness. It depends on what the children know or understand that they would be picking sweets. It is much fewer amongst the children that would understand that their choice to eat sweets every day will kill them very soon. But if we think of democracy in the question of without the regards to the consciousness of the children, but simply what they choose, given their choices of what is sweet and what is sour, we misunderstand the nature of democracy. That consciousness is an essential part of self-determination. And so I think that even during the liberation struggle, it was always argued that these were parties of intellectuals, of small educated elites, because spinach it may be unpleasant to taste at first, but when you see the results in the nourishment of your body, you understand why you should be having more spinach than sweets. But the owners of the sweet companies, unfortunately, also write school textbooks. They sponsor television adverts so that the basic consciousness of people about what has happened in this country is, so if we go to a poll, I have no doubt that the PCM and the PAC, by today's population standards, will certainly fare quite badly. But whether this is actually a reflection of people's will or it is a reflection of the poor degree of public consciousness and education is another sort of factor.
Okay. So in there lies kind of the solution for what these organizations need to be doing. What's stopping them? If we understand that we need higher levels of consciousness, why aren't we there? And I think, seeing as we're talking Biko, commemorating Biko, he was a huge proponent of self-reliance, black relying on themselves. So that defeatist mentality of outsourcing accountability for doing badly to money interests, they're not going anywhere. They're here to stay. So how do we make sure we get there in spite of the constraints? Biko was a fine example of how to get there despite your circumstances.
Yes, no, I don't disagree with you at all. I think that electoral politics is I told you I've never voted, and that includes for Azapo or the PAC. The PAC at the time, who of its unbanning was called the PAC of Azania. I believe that the PAC today is the PAC of South Africa. I don't think there was any sound basis on which
you're not sparing anyone today, are you?
No.
From the shade all over the place.
I think it should be disbanded.
Yeah.
My own sense is that there would have been no electoral basis if you interviewed Peter Raboruko or Sobukwe or Petlako for the PAC's participation in the electoral democracy of conqueror South Africa, in the same way that he refused to plead in court to campaign for an election in the conqueror state would have made no sense. Only after the restoration of territory and sovereignty to the people, if de Klerk's promise to whites was not fulfilled, there would be a sense in campaigning, but this is not the case. Now, on the point of black consciousness itself, which is not a political party, but a consciousness, I am certainly in agreement with you that I think, one of the things that the black community projects is an essentially missing element from politics today. Even people who are PC leaning very much rush to try to enter the gates of parliament. And I think South Africa's democracy, if you attempt to examine it by the statistics, already it's dubious whether even the ruling parties can be called popular. And I don't mean that just because the ANC has lost a ruling majority, but I say that because less than half of the people who can be voting in South Africa are voting. More and more people have joined me in simply not playing this game. Now, this can be seen in many ways. It suggests a loss of confidence in the theater of elections. But whereas prior to this situation arising, people could have suggested that one can't argue that there's a revolutionary situation because the ruling politicians have a mandate. Less than half of South Africans who are supposed to be voting actually authorize the current ruling order, which means many people have actually tapped out of the system. It provides a political potential for the largest group of adults in South Africa, So certainly I think that this requires particular kinds of action. I understand the work of teaching is precisely because consciousness is something which can be changed in people. And whatever the format, it requires being taught. In the days of your old man, Nabobiko, they called it conscientization. But conscientization requires exactly engagement with people. Now, an exercise like this, I don't know how large your base is, but it's precisely an attempt at troubling this exactly and breaking the kind of monopoly in the dissemination of information that those that agree with the extent order actually have. And I mean, if you study the newspapers carefully, even in the modest work we do at the university, we haven't been a stranger to the attacks of the stenographers of empire. One has found oneself in the front pages of the report being accused of indoctrinating students precisely by bringing this historical dimension to the question of education. So the disturbance and kicking response by those in power is itself a suggestion of the effectiveness, and they usually understand far better what the threat and potential of this is, because if you study the Broederbond and how it is that the National Party eventually came to power and what it did with it, you'll see that consciousness is a large part of precisely this. So, they understand this too well. But I agree that the future of the changing of these political outcomes is definitely going to rely on self-reliance efforts at various levels, rather than in entrusting the fate of our people to their party political system. It's one of the reasons why I chose the world of teaching rather than the world of politics, despite being thoroughly politically engaged and interested. It's also the reason why I have never voted. I've had a few opportunities by now. Soon, grace will be appearing. But it's precisely because this has always been clear, and there have been inklings. There have been inklings of eruptions, even in the past decade, which have erupted as a result of Black consciousness's penetration into popular consciousness. The Rhodes Must Fall protests, which occurred on campuses about 10 years ago, were in many ways inspired by precisely this inclination. And we see this in various ways but it it is faced with an oppositional mass of a particular kind of sort, and can only be perfected by the effort of continuing to try to experiment by a kind of guerrilla warfare against the extant order.
Okay. As an educator, how do you feel about the state of education in South Africa?
Whew. Much more than South Africa itself. I 2 years ago spent a semester teaching in the Netherlands, and whatever complaints I thought I had about South African students, I found to more or less be the same there. And the major problem is this machine here, the cell phone. I think the cell phone in its current form is a major threat to education everywhere, basic and higher, and public education, because it's the masters of the corporations who actually are invested in these devices. And what some economists are already suggesting, we are past capitalism now and have entered into an age of what they call techno-feudalism, which all revolves around this device.
Explain techno-feudalism.
Well, the suggestion is that, in fact, it is not the means of production which are any longer the determining factor, but that producers now buy a place in the cloud. So, for instance, if we produce dashikis, that it is not the size of our operation, however big our factory, which will determine our success, but the marketplace, which is owned by George Bezos on Amazon, where regardless of how much it costs to produce and pay all of our workers, we have to give 60% of our income to George Bezos, what he owns is nothing. He produces nothing. What he provides is a forum on which we place our product, and then we have to give him our profits, so that we are not capitalists. We are serfs on a virtual territory, which gives us access to being able to sell our goods and our labor, so that we've reverted to the feudal age, but it's on steroids because it's happening in the era of clouds. This is the basic thesis. But the point is that these machines are consciousness forming. They have affected the basic infrastructure of mind, the attention, the people that work for advertising companies that make these flashing buzzes. They study the psychology of attention and fight for our attention at all costs. And learning requires attention. It requires listening. It requires the posing of questions which arise from listening. It requires concentrating and reading. But it's also at the root of how we form relationships with other people. And what scares me the most about the new generation is that they've been reared partly by their parents, but partly by these devices. For instance, their forming of affectionate bonds revolves around applications like Tinder, where in order to find a partner that you like, you look through photographs and flash left and right before you select the person that you find. So there is a political art which is lost in my time, besikubiza ukushela. And ukushela is a form of reasoning in which you move somebody's conviction, in which they have one perception of you, and you are charged with convincing them of another perception to give you a chance for more conversation before something happens. These are social skills that are falling away as applications take over these functions. Now, my greatest fear is that these billionaires who own all of these mediums have in their very interest the destruction of man's ability to do politics, because politics is none other than the communication between a population of common interest to compare their experience, and on the basis of finding unity and to build a solidarity in order to take their power back. But it is an art of transmitting consciousness by communication. Now, what happens with these things is that people rely on their Twitter feed to find out what is happening on the campus rather than asking each other and observing for themselves. They are plugged into the machine. The students, when I was a student many years ago, there were clubs on campus. Beyond whether you were a law student or a philosophy student or an accounting student, there was a political society. There was a film club. You would have Hare Krishnas giving pamphlets, Abo Rasta, Abo Mrepa, that by the time you left the campus, you'd be directed to the library. You'd learn things. There would be a nice Rasta sister who was in the poetry club. And in order to impress her, you'd have to go to the library to read some Diop, So this has fallen away. If you go to a campus, the students don't talk to each other. There are no social and political clubs and groups. And this is affecting education immensely. And now artificial intelligence has gotten to the phase of taking over their individual reasoning for themselves. So students will ask the machine to reason on their behalf and submit that. But I believe that the destruction of this capacity to think for oneself, because the AI is also owned by the same group of people. Why is it that the latest buzz in technology is taking away thinking? What is wrong with real intelligence that individuals should begin to entrust reasoning about their own existential plight to machines? And as the years pass, our students trust these things more and more. There's a destruction of their skepticism, of asking, is this really true? How does this thing know? Where did it get this? What has it seen? Who has it spoken to? These kinds of arts are contained even in the minds of so-called uneducated or illiterate people, but they form the very basis of political existence and the ways in which solidarity and unity is used to keep the power of the people in the control of the people. So my greatest challenge or fear about education is the fact that the thing for which it was for, which is the cultivation of human freedom, is being surrendered by us too easily at the convenience of having everything at a grasp. And that people have become more and more atomized and more ignorant, not by their own will, but by the entrance of these machines into our lives. And I think by the time that we wake up, it may be too late, because there might be too few of us to use traditional politics to do something about this.
Why are you letting us off the hook? You're saying not by our will.
Well, I think for somebody who was born at a time when this wasn't the norm, let me give you an example. When I grew up, I had an enormous record collection. I would get money, pocket money every month, and I would go to the record store with a portion of it, and I would buy the record of my choice. I'd spend the whole month listening to it, discussing with others, sharing with friends other records. That's how I could listen to music. At a certain point in time, iTunes came into our lives, and we made a transition. I now have a whole library of music that I've collected over my life in my pocket. But what I haven't been trained to understand is that I don't own this. It's owned by Apple. The day I lose my job, that the debit order bounces, all the music I've accumulated on this thing goes away. The contract I have with Apple is that for the rest of my working life, I will give them a portion of my income in exchange to being able to listen to music. Now, I can see the absurdity of this because I once owned records, and I've started to actually acquire objects again because of realizing that this is slavery. It's slavery, and every aspect, word, office package. When we were kids, You would buy the disk, install it onto the computer, and it was yours for life. Now you have Office 365. You pay for the rest of your life. The day you don't pay, I know this from experience because my accounts were hacked and the debit order bounced, and I couldn't have access to my own documents. I couldn't edit them. I couldn't print them. Texts that I've invested life and years of research into simply don't belong to me. I work for the corporation in exchange for my access to my own labor. Now, I can see the absurdity of this by comparison of experience. A kid who is born into this system, where his parents own no records, he's never seen a disk because there's no role for physical data anymore, is born into this system from the beginning and conditioned to view it as natural. That's how domination works. This is why I say, of course, there is responsibility. People can conduct research, but it becomes more and more difficult for people to recognize the unnatural nature of the situation that we're living in, and that their freedoms are being undermined at and this, it extends to everything. When I was a kid, cars were built to last for 400,000 kilometers. It was a general that with proper maintenance. Cars are being created, the most premium sedans, to break down within 5 years when the maintenance plan expires, to create a condition of human beings who are perpetually in debt to the banks and buying new cars every 5 years. So this is a system in which we work ourselves into a virtual domination, and the car itself is updated by software updates, which even if it came into your possession after you stop paying the master, the update doesn't come. We need to prepare the generation of people who are coming to understand what is happening. This is how the techno-feudals work. That every part of freedom is disappearing, from listening to music to driving your car, and that the objects that you've believed were yours before, you now belong to them, or rather to their owners. Right? And so the current generation, I can see, is faced with this at a much higher level than predecessors because they have not been exposed to an alternative. And I was born into an alternative of my grandfather's 1400 that was around before I was born and continues to exist today, So I think that maybe the responsibility for the older amongst us is greater, but I think that even amongst our peers, a lot of people are too easily seduced by this convenience to see that its actual target is our freedom and to own us for the rest of our lives,
So what's the solve for that then?
Well, it's a return to the analog. Amarasta, the people that I left out of my biography. I mean, I was, Abo Rasta were a major part of my political conscientization. And, their association of the Babylon system with everything that shines, and the return to the essential, to the tactical, is the only approach. Taking control over everything that you put into yourself. For me, what I do about this is to make this the subject of class, to integrate this unfolding reality, which I see as an enemy of human freedom, into what I teach my students, into how I prescribe work and what I bring to their attention, and to bring it to the attention of my community and family as a major threat, which requires our attention. But it is precisely attention which these things are fighting. So yes, it can only be fought. I'm sure there are movements of people that are directed towards this end. But I hope that even our conversation will bring some of your viewers to think about this fugitive freedom,
Yeah. Okay. So I give you a magic wand, and my magic wand bestows on you powers to change anything. and any number of things that you want to change and achieve the world you require, where would you deploy it?
In economics, in political economy, I would actually I would place the initial goals of the PAC into practice. That is the restoration of sovereign title to territory. I would take the entire territory of the country back. I would dispossess the corporations who unduly came into its possession and make the total profits of the company belong to the state. Then I would distribute the profits which were traded. I would also, of course, pursue reparations from all those who unlawfully and unjustly benefited from this, to pay back what they have taken knowingly to the people of this country. Then I would distribute this in spending, beginning first with making sure that a law is made that food may not be destroyed, which is good for the sake of profit, that clothes may not be destroyed for the sake of profit, and to distribute the minimum income required for people to have a dignified life, so social housing, to fulfill the promises of our supposed Bill of Rights in actual, without the qualification which the constitutional order makes, within available resources, because the resources which are available are greatly more infinite than what we pretend. And that is because of our obedience to the logic of private property and profit. So this is the first logic that I would abolish, by bringing all things under the control of the sovereign will of the people and dividing according to the needs of people.
Okay. I would be very concerned about you taking all these profits and giving them, you say the sovereign will of the people, but I imagine that it would be through the custodianship of the state, of government, when we have so much money that is going to waste in the hands of the same entities. How could you assure me that you've used my magic wand fruitfully?
Well,
and allay my fears in that regard.
Oh, well, I wouldn't be Ukongolos to begin with, I mean, yeah, so I mean, the government which I'm talking about, of course, would also be my dictatorship. Ukhumbule ukuthi it's my one.
It's your one.
Yes, it would be my dictatorship, which is organized on the basis of Black consciousness, So, so the point, I mean, would be a restoration of parliamentary sovereignty. And as we improve the education of people, which the state would provide, also by banishing these things from children, and by limiting the power of these corporations to turn people into serfs, would mean that constituencies of people would be in a position, by exposure to better and better education, to make better decisions in their own interests, which would be placed at the command of, but I guess that the criminal law of the Chinese places to death anyone who steals from the state coffers. I think, Guti, I'm a pacifist only to one extent, but I do believe that crimes against state they deserve death, and so I think that the placing, as I said, fear is at the basis of obedience to the law. And I don't think that the people you are talking about fear that we saw the recent press conference by the general. It's very clear that these guys don't fear the will of the people, but to convert that will into a force which can attach consequence to its violation.
This General Mkhwana.
Yes. It's essential to attach consequence to violations of the public trust by a general law of application, that such a thing leads you to life imprisonment, and that you are never. So we have recidivists who are in charge at every level of the system, that nobody can possibly take any notion of rule of law seriously, from the lawyers that defend the crooks to the ones who are responsible for making the very laws that they violate. So the consequence management, especially of those in charge, to stop attaching consequences to the crimes of petty thieves who have to steal because they are hungry, to attaching consequences to the crimes of thieves who cause hunger in society by betraying their responsibility which they've been charged with,
True. Powerful closing for that, and thank you for bringing up General Mkhwanazi. Shout out to General Mkhwanazi, long may you live. We thank you, and thanks for bringing respectability and credibility to law enforcement as well.